Well, hello, everybody at Westminster Canterbury. This is a live stream. I don't know who's live or who will watch it later, but whenever this crosses your screen, happy to have you here. My name is Peter Hartwig, and I'll tell you more about me in a second, but if we want to jump to a title slide there. This lecture, which is going to last about an hour and change, is a lecture I've sort of cheekily titled, Why Theological Liberalism is Liberal and Why Theological Conservatism is Not. This is a lecture that I've given once or twice in the past, and some friends of mine at Westminster Canterbury asked if I'd do it for you all, and so I'm happy to revisit it for myself, and hopefully you'll get something out of it. Just a little about me. Again, my name is Peter Hartwig, and I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, but I spend some summers in Virginia Beach working at a church there. And so that's how I've gotten to know your community a little bit. Some of the people that work there and find themselves at Galilee, which is where I'm at on Sunday mornings. I know a couple of you there. I now am theologian in residence at a church in Washington, D.C. called National Community Church. And I'm, it's, as you know, the middle of the COVID-19 crisis. So I've been displaced from my normal day, which is at Princeton Theological Seminary. So I am a pastor's kid, and I'm currently in my dad's office because it's the only office I have on offer right now. But I grew up in Charlottesville, as I said, and I went to the University of Virginia, where I studied religion and classics, which is Greek and Latin and a bit of Hebrew. And then I went on to the University of Cambridge in the UK and did a Master's of Philosophy in Theology there. And now I'm up at Princeton Theological Seminary doing a Master's of Divinity. So my grandparents always ask me, what are you going to do with that? And I don't really know, but I like school and I like what I study. And I had a professor, I asked him once, do you think I have what it takes in order to make it in academia? And he said, what it takes to make it in academia is the belief that you will die if you don't get to study the thing you want to study. And I thought, well, dang, that's me. So I'm kind of in it for the long haul, I guess. So my field is theology, and I've got a slide here that I hope is kind of helpful to get us on the same page about what we're going to be talking about today. Theology is the discipline or the attempt of learning to speak rightly about God. And theology comes from two Greek words, which are theos, which means God, and logos, which literally means word, but over time came to mean sort of a discourse about something or the study of something. So theology is the study of God. Maybe more accurately, it's the attempt to learn to say true things about God. And theology is a discipline that is spoken and written, we believe. And so people who do theology are called theologians as opposed to biologists. Evidently, and I don't understand the background here, but it's been explained to me that if it ends in gen, it kind of has to do with words in religion. And if it ends in gist, then it kind of has to do with science. So anyway, I'm a theologian and I study theology. And there are different subfields in the field of theology. And those subfields were established kind of in the 1700s by a thinker we're going to talk about today named Friedrich Schleiermacher. But I do specifically two kinds of theology. I work in a field called systematic theology, which is the attempt to give an ordered and comprehensive account of all Christian thought, life, and practice. And I also do a field of theology called historical theology. And historical theology is the attempt to plot the changes in the history of Christian theology. And so Christians haven't always expressed themselves and expressed their beliefs in the same way over time. And so historical theology traces that movement. I'm looking at my slides here, and you might see that I've got up a very elaborate painting, which currently is on the wall in the Vatican. It's in rooms that were painted by Raphael. And this painting faces a painting that we often call the School of Athens. It was originally called philosophy. And this is a painting that was meant to depict theology as opposed to philosophy. And that's important, that philosophy and theology face each other in these rooms in the Vatican, because that's actually true like in real life. The history of theology is inseparable from the history of philosophy. The two of them are bound together over time. And even if you study someone like Martin Luther, who thought philosophy had a bad influence on theology, you still have to learn the history of philosophy to understand that bad influence. And so this lecture is kind of tying together three fields: theology, philosophy, and history. So I know not everybody watching this is probably religious in any meaningful sense. And that's okay, because this isn't really a lecture for religious people. It's just a lecture for anybody who, for whatever reason, happens to be interested in the history of Protestantism and what Protestants have thought over the last about 300 years. And so maybe you think all Protestant theology is wrong and just sort of hogwash, in which case, hopefully this is an interesting lecture and people getting things wrong. And I do admit that theology is a bit of a weird field, especially these days. Not a lot of people go to graduate school for theology. And so it's going to be helpful, I think, this explanation that I've just given, of getting us kind of on the same page of how theology works. Theology is the attempt to speak rightly about God. I am sure that everybody at some point has heard the complaint that academics use big words in a way that might be unnecessarily confusing. But the truth of the matter is, academics develop a vocabulary that helps them say a lot in a very short amount of time. And so there's 4 words that I'd like to familiarize you all with, so that we can use them fluidly in this lecture, and also in whatever sort of Q&A we end up having after this lecture. You can use them fluidly too. And so this is one last thing before we get on the road with what I actually want to talk about. There are 4 words that are really important to the history of theology and the history of philosophy. And those 4 words are ontology, metaphysics, hermeneutics, and epistemology. I know they're huge and a little terrifying, but take a quick breath. Ontology is the study of being itself. This is a field of study that came out of classical Greek philosophy. The Greeks realized that the one thing that everything shares is existence, and so they got interested in existence itself. And so ontos logos is the Greek phrase for the study of being. The second word is metaphysics. Physics is the study of everything that is real and is physical, and metaphysics is the study of everything that's real that is not physical. So justice is a metaphysical notion, love is a metaphysical notion, but God is also a metaphysical notion. And that's going to be important when we talk about Immanuel Kant in just a couple seconds. The third word is hermeneutics. Interpretation is the study of texts. Hermeneutics is the study of interpretation. So in my own field, maybe you would come to the Bible and you'd read one passage, and I would come to the Bible and I read the same passage, but we would come away thinking different things. And the difference between us is our versions of interpretation, and the study of that difference is hermeneutics. So hermeneutics is the study of how people interpret texts. And the last word is epistemology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge and how people come to know things. And so we're about to talk about some ways in which Immanuel Kant and Friedrich Schleiermacher had an extended disagreement over how epistemology works. And so we might as well get on the road with that. So the first figure we're going to look at is Immanuel Kant. And he predates the photograph, but this is sort of what he looked like. And here's another picture of him when he was a touch younger. Our story today begins with this philosopher, Immanuel Kant. He's an Enlightenment philosopher. He's probably the most influential of the Enlightenment philosophers. And more than any other single modern mind, Kant is responsible for the way in which we think. He made a really important move in philosophy. And that important move was what you'd call an empiricist epistemology. What Kant believed, what Kant was trying to communicate to us, was that human beings can only be certain about things that they empirically experience. So what your empirical senses, touch, taste, smell, sight, hearing, that's the way that human beings take in certain information. And if something doesn't come through that avenue, if it doesn't come by your empirical senses, then you can't be certain about it. All you can do is deduce it. And so Kant is also famous for this thing called the transcendental deduction, where Kant thought to himself, well, the world comes at us as all of this empirical sense data, but we seem to organize the world in important ways. So we all experience things happening one after another, and we call that time. And Kant thought, well, we don't directly experience time, but we need the idea of time in order to make sense of our experience. And so we deduce that there's this thing called time. And that transcendental deduction is also where God lived for Kant. Kant is famous for 3 important books that he didn't write until his 50s, which is really encouraging for me. And they are called The Critique of Pure Reason, The Critique of Practical Reason, and The Critique of Judgment. And together we call them the 3 critiques. And what Kant was doing there was trying to sort of flip the script on how theology and philosophy had always worked for Kant. Before Kant, philosophy was the study of goodness and truth and beauty, usually in the order of truth, goodness, and beauty. And for medieval philosophers, truth was rationality, goodness included a sort of moral goodness, and beauty was this objective category. Things either were beautiful or they weren't. And Kant writes the 3 critiques of each of those concepts in order. And what he's symbolically saying is a great big no to the philosophy that comes before him. So the critique of pure reason is the critique of truth. The critique of practical reason is the critique of goodness. And the critique of judgment is the critique of beauty. And the critique of pure reasons like that big, practical reasons like that big, and judgment is like that big. And that reflects a lot of how modern people actually think about the world. That we believe that we navigate the world mostly through our empirical senses, things like that's how we get information. And then we try to make decisions on that information. But whether or not something is beautiful is kind of that's sort of the last thing we care about. We care that we actually own a car, we care that the car works, and then we care how the car looks, most of us. A really important thing that a really important implication of what Kant is saying there is that if you only get information through sensory data, then you can never get information about God, because God is not like my phone or my computer or this desk. God, you can't touch God, you can't see God, you can't smell God. A lot of people would say you can't talk to God, though other people might disagree. And so at the end of the 3 critiques, at the end of this empiricist notion of knowledge, at the end of Kant's notion of a deduction, a transcendental deduction, that all sums up to say theology is basically impossible. It's impossible because you are trying to say with certainty something that you can't possibly speak certainly about. Theology is not possible because you could never talk about God directly. God can't be seen, so God cannot ever enter the realm of certain knowledge. And so that made a lot of theologians nervous that he was going to put us out of a job. And so what we're basically going to talk about today is 2 people who tried to save theology from Kant. And the first of those is a man named Friedrich Schleiermacher. Schleiermacher is called the Father of Liberalism. And what we're going to see is that there are many kinds of liberalism in our world. There's political liberalism and social liberalism, and I'm told fiscal liberalism. But we're talking very specifically about theological liberalism. And theological liberalism is a very humble claim. It's just the claim that experience is an important source of information for how people talk and think about God. And Schleiermacher is the first person to really give that sensibility shape. So Friedrich Daniel Ernst Schleiermacher was born in 1768 and died in 1834. He had a Pietist background, and we're going to talk a lot about that in a second. His career is all about the attempt to respond to Kant, at least on my reading of his career. And the big thing he's going to say is that theology isn't actually about God. It's about something else. And in so doing, what he's trying to do is defend religion, defend the importance of religion and the desirability of religion in the world after Kant. And so where I'd like to start talking about Schleiermacher is in his Pietist background. So we're going to talk a little bit about this movement called Pietism that was really Schleiermacher's first personal context. So in the 17th and 18th centuries, in the 1600s and the 1700s, there was a movement in German Lutheranism that was trying to respond to the scholasticism that had cropped up in Lutheranism. And that basically means there were all of these Lutherans that started to think to themselves, you know, all our religion is like studying and like ideas, and it's super academic. And all of our pastors are trained as really, really good, like theoreticians, but they're not so great at pastoring. And they might also not be such great people. And so Lutheranism at this period started to feel really dry and sort of hollow. And so there was a movement centered around a couple important figures to try and make German Lutheranism more affective, more about the experience of religion, and also to cut against the idea that religion was primarily about theology. And so there's a couple important names here who maybe you've heard of once or twice, or maybe you haven't. One is Johann Arndt, who wrote a book called True Christianity. The movement gets its name from a book by Philip Jakob Spener called The Pia Desideria, which means the pious affections. And that book was really the book that set the agenda for Pietism. There were two later important figures, August Hermann Francke, who founded an important Pietist university, and the Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf, who lives from 1700 to 1760. And Zinzendorf is going to be important for our story. I've got another slide here, just kind of what I've said before about the shape and kind of flavor of Pietism. It was frustrated with how academic and sort of divisive and debatey things had gotten at this period in history. You may or may not know this, but Calvinists and Lutherans were in different and competing churches supported by different competing governments. And that changed in Schleiermacher's life. But in the beginning days of Pietism, Lutheran pastors were basically trained to disagree with and to beat Calvinist pastors in debates. That's kind of what seminary was about. And so the clergy had become really disappointing to these people, to people like Spener. They thought that religion was way too much in people's heads and needed to move back into people's hearts. And so they suggested a particular model for how church should happen. And that was people should gather together in small groups to read the Bible and pray together in their homes. And maybe you've been to churches, if you're a church person, that focuses on small groups or life groups, or they'll have a lot of reading groups, or they'll have a weekly Bible study, and it's not run at the church. It's like hosted in somebody's house. The Pietists were truly the first people to do that. That was not a practice in Christianity before then. And they called these the Collegia Pietatis, the colleges of piety. And as you can see there, the Pia Desideria, the Collegia Pietatis, Pietism is getting its name from all this. And they were also, parenthetically, immensely anti-Catholic. which is pretty normal, unfortunately, for this period. But that's the way it was. There's an important figure in the personal life of Schleiermacher, and in Pietism as a movement, and that is the Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf, who Karl Barth, who's someone else we're going to talk about, called the most creative theologian since Luther. Nicholas Zinzendorf was born in 1700. He died in 1760. He had a good amount of money, good amount of family money. And here I've got a quick timeline of his life. But the two things that I really want to focus on in Zinzendorf's life are in May 1727, Zinzendorf was part of the brotherly agreement at Herrnhut. Herrnhut is was a community of pietist Christians living together, and they were Herrnhut means the Lord's watch or the Lord's protection, and it was this intense attempt for pietists to live together in community to see their vision of Christianity executed, executed in the sense of accomplished. There was an important experience at Herrnhut where on this random afternoon during a prayer meeting, they all experienced the presence of God, or so they said, in an immensely intense and sort of miraculous way. And that was a real high point for people who, as I've said, believed that religion needed to move from your head to your heart. And so that's this the legacy of Herrnhut. It was this place where pietists were living together, where they saw their vision of an intense emotional Christianity accomplished. And equally importantly, Nicholas von Zinzendorf was a personal friend and a theological influence on John Wesley. And that's going to be really important for the long trajectory of this story, because Wesley is going to bring this kind of Christianity to America. So Zinzendorf had a couple of major themes in his theology. As with all pietists, he was really interested in the affective side of faith, heart instead of the head, and attention on correct feeling, orthopathos. Zinzendorf was also really convinced that the cross and the crucified Jesus was central to Christianity. Christian faith for Zinzendorf was about the death of Jesus for our sins. And so it's a pretty intense notion of Christian faith. And Zinzendorf takes a lot of this from Luther. So that community, Herrnhut, is the community where Schleiermacher is raised, and at least for part of his life. And his father was a part of the community at Herrnhut. And so that is the background to Schleiermacher. That's kind of the background community that Schleiermacher is coming from. And so I like to call Schleiermacher the Prodigal Pietist. Schleiermacher was born in 1768. So he never knew Zinzendorf personally. He just lived in his wake. Schleiermacher would grow up to be a hugely popular preacher in Berlin at Trinity Church. And his funeral would actually be the most widely attended funeral of the century. He was a deeply, deeply beloved human being. Again, he was raised among the Moravian Pietists, which is what those called themselves at Herrnhut. He's got that Pietist background. And then he's educated at the Pietist University of Halle. And at a key moment in Schleiermacher's life, he starts reading Kant. And again, Kant has made people really doubtful that theology is possible, which, if you're a pietist, is really, really bad news. Kant sounds kind of like this nasty academic philosopher who's trying to ruin all of our faiths. And so Kant was outlawed at a couple places where Schleiermacher was educated, like at his high school, but he read him anyway. And so what we see is Schleiermacher coming from that intense religious head-to-heart community, and reading Kant, who's probably like the most heady and academic of the philosophers of his day. And Schleiermacher is sort of convinced of what Kant is saying, but he's also got this religious background that he doesn't want to give up on and that he thinks is telling the truth about the world. And so Schleiermacher's career can be read as the attempt to take that Pietist background and that Kantian philosophy and marry them in a theology that can take Europe forward. And so he writes two important books. One is called On Religion, Speeches to Its Cultured Despisers. And the word for speeches in German is Reden. And so they're oftentimes called the Reden. The other major book is called Der Christliche Glaube, which means the Christian faith. It got nicknamed, even in his life, the Glaubenslehre, which means the faith teaching. And we're going to take a kind of in-depth look at that. But in line with this story of Schleiermacher's life, here I have an excerpt from a letter that Schleiermacher wrote to his father. And what we see in this letter is a moment where Schleiermacher does this really difficult thing. He has to admit to his father that he's actually changed opinions. And according to the theology of his father, this committed pietist, Schleiermacher is not really a Christian anymore. So if you take a look, maybe you can see it on the screen, at that central paragraph, he has this phrase, "Faith is the regalia of the Godhead. So you say, alas, dearest Father, if you believe that without faith, no one can attain salvation in the next world, nor tranquility in this. And such I know is your belief. Oh, then pray to God to grant it to me, for to me it is now lost. I cannot believe that he who called himself the Son of Man," that's Jesus, "was the true eternal God. I cannot believe that his death was a vicarious atonement." Remember, that's what Zinzendorf had been preaching a lot about, I said earlier, because he never expressly said so himself. "And I cannot believe it to have been necessary, because God, who evidently did not create man for perfection, but for the pursuit of it, cannot possibly intend to punish him eternally, because they have not attained it." So then Schleiermacher goes on to say, "Alas, best of fathers, the deep and acute suffering which I endure while I'm writing this letter prevents me from giving you in detail the history of my soul as regards my opinions, or all my strong reasons for entertaining them. But I implore you, do not look upon them as merely transient views without deep roots." Schleiermacher knows that this is going to be a big rift in his relationship with his father. And in fact, it was. There was a period where they didn't talk, and they didn't talk affectionately. And again, if you hear that pietist background against that Kantian philosophy, you can hear the way in which Schleiermacher is troubled by what Kant is saying, and how Schleiermacher is moving away from that early pietist theology. However, we get a second letter that from 1802, in which Schleiermacher seems to have returned to a sense of faith. He says, "Here it was for the first time that I awoke to the consciousness of the relations of man to a higher world. Here it was that the mystic tendency developed itself, which has been of so much importance to me and has supported and carried me through all my storms of skepticism. Then it was only germinating. Now it has attained its full development. And may I say that after all, I have passed through. I've become a Moravian." What he says there is Herrnhuter, again, only of a higher order. Now that paragraph uses some words that we didn't hear from the Pietists themselves, and that we haven't heard before in this lecture. But what Schleiermacher is doing there is trying to find new terms that can encapsulate the faith of his youth. So when he says mystic tendency, what he's talking about is pietist religion. And when he talks about the consciousness of the relations of man to a higher world, what he's trying to say there is a philosophically translated way of describing the pietist devotion to God. And so he does, in the end, think that he has managed to retrieve his pietist faith from the philosophical critiques of Kant and the Enlightenment, but he's going to have to use different terms than they used. The book that I want to very briefly talk about as an encapsulation of Schleiermacher's work is his biggest book called Der Christliche Glaube, the Christian Faith, but again was nicknamed the Glaubenslehre. And the opening of the Glaubenslehre is has a particular shape. We'll get to the quote that's on the screen in a minute, but the shape of the Glaubenslehre that kind of sets that quote up looks something like this. Schleiermacher wants to ease you in to the internal logic of Christian theology. And there's a debate in Schleiermacher interpretation over whether what Schleiermacher is doing here is starting with Christian theology and deducing a general category, or starting with a general category and logically deducing Christianity. And we're gonna, as this lecture goes on, we're gonna see why that's an important and central debate. But the Glaubenslehre starts off by talking about religion as a general category. And the word that Schleiermacher often uses for religion is piety. Piety, he says, is the heart of religion. And piety is, Schleiermacher tells us, a feeling of absolute dependence. So the German word for feeling is Gefühl, and it doesn't mean feeling in the sense of emotions. Like I might feel very honored to be asked to give this lecture, and you might feel like this isn't going so well. Just kidding. But feelings like that are not what Schleiermacher is talking about. Schleiermacher is talking about a capacity that he believes human beings have that sits between rational knowledge and simple emotion. Human beings have this ability to intuit the world on a sub-rational level. It's a way that we're engaged with the world with this faculty that's not just our thinking minds and not just our feeling hearts. And that's what Gefühl is. That's what feeling is. What he's trying to do is look at Kant, who, as you'll recall, said that you can only get information about the world through your senses. He's trying to say, no, there's another way to get information about the world. That's not your empirical senses. That's not just the affective reality of his pietist background. That's not just the rationality of the Enlightenment movement. It's this other thing where you can intuit something deeply true about the world. And he calls that feeling. So Schleiermacher would say this, whoever's watching this, you, Mary, or Todd, or Jane, or Robert, if you take a second, you'll notice that you know that you don't absolutely control the world. So for instance, I can feel that this chair is keeping me in place. So I have a feeling of being limited. But I do also have a feeling of partial of freedom, because I can move things in the world. So I can pick this up and put this down, and I can twist around in the chair. So I'm partially dependent on this chair because it's holding me up and it limits me and keeps me in place. But I also have partial control over the chair because I'm free to move it and wiggle it around. And Schleiermacher says that we all have that feeling of partial dependence and partial freedom. But we also have this deeper feeling, and that's a feeling of absolute dependence. Now, you again, Mary and Jane and Todd and Robert, you know that you don't control the world. So you can't just decide, for instance, to right now make a plane take off in Arizona. I don't know. There are all of these things in the world that happen, and they don't happen with your control in mind, and nobody asks your opinion. Fundamentally, in fact, the world controls you. Now, not in the sense that everything you do is determined, but just in the sense, Schleiermacher wants to say, that if you take a second to reflect on your experience, and if you take a minute to think about how fragile human beings are in the world, if you take a second to think about how much affects us without us necessarily affecting it, if you think about how easy it is for human beings to move out of existence, then you would realize that we actually, at root, are absolutely dependent on the universe. At our base, we are actually something that the universe supports. And Schleiermacher says that that fundamental intuition, that fundamental feeling, that's what piety is. And Schleiermacher tells us that God is actually the thing that is supporting us. God is the thing on which we are absolutely dependent. And so that's the first move in the Glaubenslehre. The first move is to say religion is that part of human life where piety, where the feeling of total dependence gets expressed. But, he says, the feeling of total dependence never gets expressed purely. The feeling of total dependence always is expressed in human life in some modulated form. And that modulated form is the religions. So at first we had religion, piety. Now we have the expressions of piety, and those are the religions. And so in its own way, Schleiermacher would say, Judaism expresses the feeling of total dependence. If he knew about them, which he didn't, but Native American religions would express the feeling of total dependence. Islam is actually now well known by this period to Western Europeans, and so he talks a bit about how Islam expresses the feeling of total dependence. But he says they all do it in their own in different ways. And you can assess them, Schleiermacher would say, by how well they manage to express the feeling of absolute dependence. And the best religion at doing that, Schleiermacher says, is Christianity. So here's what you have in the Glaubenslehre. You have religion, the religions, Christian religion. Schleiermacher is trying to invite you in to a smooth thought process that rhetorically starts from the universal experience, the feeling of total dependence, to the particular expression of the feeling of total dependence, to a very unique expression of the feeling of total dependence, namely Christian faith. And so you can see that as reflected in this quote that I pulled out of the Glaubenslehre. He says, however diverse they might be, and there he's talking about religions, however diverse religions might be, what all expressions of piety, that is religions, have in common, whereby they are all at the same time distinguished from all other feelings, that's again the feeling of partial dependence or the feeling of partial freedom. Thus, the self-same nature of piety is this, that we are conscious of ourselves as absolutely dependent, or which intends the same thing as being in relation with God. Religion, Schleiermacher says, is about becoming conscious of the fact that we are in relation, in an absolutely dependent relation on God. Religions are the attempt to explain that, to live into that, to depict that, to capture that. in Christian religion is how that feeling of absolute dependence gets tied to what Schleiermacher will call the consciousness of being redeemed by the Redeemer. Now, if you think about that, and that all takes place in the first part of the Glaubenslehre. The second part of the Glaubenslehre is going to be his actual revisitation of all the classical claims that Protestants have wanted to make for the last 200 years before him. And he's going to show how each of them are actually an expression of the feeling of total dependence. Here you can sort of see why there's a debate in Schleiermacher interpretation. Has Schleiermacher taken a general category of religion and slapped it on Christian faith? Or has Schleiermacher started logically with Christian faith and drawn out this idea of religion so that he could explain it more easily to people? And maybe some of you have read the Glaubenslehre, or you will go read the Glaubenslehre. I don't think it's a particularly popular text these days. But if you read it and you come up with an opinion on that, you are more than welcome to reach out to me. It's my own opinion that Schleiermacher actually does the second thing, that he deduces religion from Christian faith. But that's not what the theologian Karl Barth thought, and we're going to come back around to that in a second. Okay, here's the really big payoff. Here's the point of all this Schleiermacher stuff. Schleiermacher effectively comes up with a new definition for theology. Theology, he says, is not actually talking directly about God. The theos is not actually the object of theology. It is Christian consciousness. It's the feeling of piety. It's not God that theologians talk about. It's the feeling of piety. And so if we imagine Kant and Schleiermacher having a conversation, it would look like this. Kant goes, hey guys, you can't speak about God directly because God is not the kind of thing that is given to your empirical senses. And so he says, theology is not possible. And Schleiermacher says, well, theology is possible. And that's okay because we were never talking about God directly anyway. That's not what religion is about, says Schleiermacher. We were talking about the experience of God. That's what religion is about. And that is the moment at which theological liberalism is born. It's the moment at which theology becomes not about God directly, but about the experience of God and God indirectly. Schleiermacher, it's hard to overemphasize how much Schleiermacher was beloved, how influential he was as a thinker, and how much people thought that Schleiermacher had really figured a lot out. Hegel, if that's a familiar term in philosophy, Hegel was a philosopher who thought Schleiermacher was wrong and offered a different option, an option personally that is not part of my research. But Schleiermacher remained immensely influential until the next theologian we're going to talk about, the most important theologian of the 20th century by far, a theologian named Karl Barth. And it looks like Barth, but it's actually Barth, because in German, THs come out as Ts oftentimes. Barth was born in 1886, so he's living a good chunk after Schleiermacher. Barth felt young that he wanted to be a theologian, so he studied in Berlin. And he was studying with an important theologian named Adolf von Harnack, but he never finished his PhD, and he took up a pastorate in the town of Sophenville. And in 1914, an important event happened in German academia, which was called the Manifesto of 93 German Intellectuals to the Civilized World. And for those of you who are 20th century history buffs, you're probably clocking the fact that in 1914, what we have here is a academic endorsement of Kaiser Wilhelm II's war plan. You've got all of these academics, including Adolf von Harnack, Barth's teacher, who says, who gives a theological warrant for the war. And this really bothers Barth. The idea that World War I is something that Christians should celebrate was distressing to him. And so he goes back and he starts a little Bible study with him and a very close friend, Edvard Tornesen, and they read through the book of Romans in the Bible, which is a large letter that St. Paul wrote to the church in Rome. And he published in 1919 a book, which in German is a Römerbrief, and that's just the word for the Epistle to the Romans. He published the first edition of his commentary on it. And that commentary was a immensely aggressive theological attack on and disagreement with the theological liberalism that went back to Schleiermacher, but had been encapsulated in his day by Adolf von Harnack, his teacher. Barth, that book does so well and is so impressive that Barth ends up, even though he never finishes his PhD, becoming a professor, first at the University of Göttingen, and then at Bonn, and then at the University of Basel. And in 1923-24, when he's a professor, Barth actually gives a series of lectures on Schleiermacher, in which he talks about how important Schleiermacher is. Barth became a mentor to the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who might be a recognizable name to some of you. He's become popular these days. And in 1962, after Barth retired, he traveled to America. And on that slide, you can see a photo of him not far from where I live in Princeton at the chapel with Martin Luther King Jr. was there. Came to hear Barth talk at the university chapel. Barth's great work in life is a book called Kirchliche Dogmatik, which means the Church Dogmatics, which was first published in 1932 and went on for 14 more volumes over 10,000 pages. So to call it a book is a little misleading, but Barth spent the rest of his life working on that text. And Barth's theology, at least on my reading, centers around two central themes. One is the ontological crisis between God and the world. And again, if you'll remember, ontology is the study of being. And so what we mean when we say ontological crisis is that God actually is not identical with the world. And God actually can't be identified with anything in the world. Because if God made the world, Barth says, then God has to have made all of it, even being itself. So God is actually a radically free and, in a way, radically distant being from the world. But God is a being that couldn't actually be a being, because if God were a being, then God could not have created being. It's a little tricky, but what I hope you can hear is that it sounds very unlike Schleiermacher saying, we can feel that we are totally dependent on the world, and our total dependence is actually our being in relation to God. Barth wants to say, well, we might be totally dependent on the world, but if we're totally dependent on the world, then that doesn't mean we're totally dependent on God. God's not the world. God is far from the world. There's a crisis between God and the world. The second part of Barth's theology that's really important is something that we call Christocentrism. And Christocentrism is the belief that all theology is communicated to us, all the truth about God is communicated to us in the incarnation of Jesus. And that is a huge response to Kant, because Kant said God is not given to sensory perception. Can't see God, can't touch God, can't smell God, can't talk to God. And Barth says, well, actually God is, and that's Jesus. Kant says we can't get up to God, but Barth says, well, that doesn't stop God from getting to us. And so Barth's theology is all about focusing on Jesus as the way in which we learn to talk about God. It is hard to overemphasize how big a deal Karl Barth is. He was on the cover of Time. We will read his work for the next 1,000 years. Pope Pius X called him the most important theologian since Thomas Aquinas. He's just a really, really big deal. And in his life, if you've got your dates right in your head, he actually lived through the Third Reich. He was teaching in Switzerland at the University of Basel by that time. But Barth was deeply engaged with a movement called the Confessing Church. And that's a movement in which Dietrich Bonhoeffer was also involved. And there's a little photo here of some of the people that were involved with the Confessing Church, and you can see Bonhoeffer there on your left. But Barth's great contribution, again, is Kirchliche Dogmatik, the church dogmatics. And it's his response to Schleiermacher's Glaubenslehre. And that's it right there. That's the whole book. It takes a while to get through. And Barth's notion of theology in that book, remember, Schleiermacher said, no, theology is about the experience of God. Barth's theology says, no, theology is about the Word of God. And the Word for Barth is Jesus himself, the Bible as it's written, and the sermons that talk about God. And there you have a famous German crucifix that currently hangs in the Louvre. That idea, the starkness of the Word of God in Jesus, is what drives Barth's theology. Whereas on the other hand, the affectiveness and the experience of God in Schleiermacher is what drove theology. And so you can probably hear what it would sound like, again, if Barth had a conversation with Kant. It looks like this. Kant says, well, we can't speak about God directly. And Barth says, well, that's okay, because we were never speaking about God directly anyway. We were only saying what God already said about God's self. For Schleiermacher, theology is not directly about God, it's about the experience of God, and about God indirectly. For Barth, theology is about the Word of God directly, and it's about God indirectly. And so we have both of these two options as two possible responses to Kant. The Word of God versus the experience of God. That's what's going to ground your options in theology. Now, both of them have their problems, and both of them have their own funny issues, but I'd like to talk in the last couple minutes, instead of all that, about what we are left with and how these two influences come to us in America. So, as I've already mentioned, Schleiermacher's own Pietist community was an influence on Wesley. And Wesley brought a lot of that Pietist religion to America. I've got a slide up that's got two photos, one of a man and one of a woman. And these two people sort of represent the way in which these two traditions, the one that finds its source in Schleiermacher and the one that finds its source in Barth, get expressed. So on the one hand, we have a woman named Nadia Bolz-Weber, who's a pastor in Colorado. And on the other hand, we have Jerry Falwell, who was popular in the 80s. And as you can probably tell, Nadia Bolz-Weber is brilliant and hilarious and sultry, tatted up pastor. And Jerry Falwell is a pretty straight-laced guy, right? Well, Nadia Bolz-Weber is a theological liberal. She believes that the experience of God is actually where theology can start about God. But over time, since Schleiermacher, what counts as an experience of God has gotten much bigger. And so theological liberalism in America today is actually the attempt to look at all of the experiences that we have, for instance, the experience of being a woman, or the experience of being a veteran, or the experience of being a minority identity, and what those experiences tell us about God. That's theological liberalism. On the other hand, you've got someone like Jerry Falwell, who he thought theology was about the Bible. Our experiences of God don't tell us about God. The Bible tells us about God. And I bring up these two characters because I want to illustrate the fact that when we talk about what's gone on in Schleiermacher and Barth, we aren't just talking about random historical figures. We are actually talking about two people that send, you might say, traditions to America. They represent traditions to America that can actually help us interpret the religious landscape of America these days. So it might be true that theological liberals are political liberals and theological conservatives are political conservatives, but actually, that might not necessarily be true. What is true, though, is if you're the sort of person that pays attention to the way in which religion is influencing American politics or American life, or the way in which American religion has its own internal debates, what you can often find you can often find a lot of clarity if you just take a second to wonder whether this person thinks that their own experience of the world or the other's experience of the world can tell them about God, or whether it's something like the Bible, some objective reality beyond their experience that tells them about God. And so academic theologians, we have been left with a problem. How are we actually going to figure out how to say true things about God? Schleiermacher has given us one option, but it has lots of problems. One of those major problems is, in Germany in the 20th century, in Barth's day, well, the experience of being German and of joining the Nazi Reich became actually an important experience of God. And so you have lots of Lutheran Christians and even the state church keeling over, you might say, to the Third Reich. And on the other hand, you've got Barth, whose theology of the Bible oftentimes can leave us with a Christianity or a religion that's sort of unflinching. And so I've just put up a couple photos of some famous contemporary theologians because I hope to give you an imagination for how pervasive the tradition that Schleiermacher and Barth has left us with really is, how seriously we take the problem they left us with, how many of us in theology are working on those problems, and how diverse the group of theologians we look at, you can see here, are struggling to continue to learn and learn better how to say true things about God. And so we have people of all different races, men, women, theological liberals, conservatives, Catholics, Protestants, Anglicans, monks, parish pastors, and a lot of university professors, all trying to find some way to learn to say true things about God. That kind of brings me to the end of the content of what I hope to say. It's my hope that this has been entertaining and in the future will prove useful as a way of continuing what I think so many of us try to do as citizens in America, which is to navigate the religious landscape that we see in front of us. As theology has become less popular of a field of study, I think it's ironically become more important, because what theologians and what religious academics have figured out about religion, about how religions, how they work and how religious people work and think, I think is actually really useful for understanding the world in which we live. So I hope this has proved useful to you. I hope there's some live interaction with this in the near future. But if I never see any of you again or any of you face to face, it's been a joy talking to you, and I hope you've enjoyed. Have a wonderful day.